All right, everybody, welcome to the video here for the next lesson, lesson number 9 in the trig unit. So what we notice here in one of my two periods, I forgot to do number, or we didn't have time to do number 6. So let's start here. So to figure out where the midline is, I first have to figure out where my minimum value is. So my minimum value is at -2. My maximum value is at 6. So the difference between the bottom and the top of this graph is 8. So if I count up 1, 2, 3, 4, I'd figure out where the middle is. So the middle of this graph is at 2. So the midline is y equals 2. I notice to get from the midline to get to the top of the graph, this distance here is 4. So the amplitude is 4. Now, the first thing we have to do, now that we know the amplitude of midline, is we have to figure out what kind of curve we have. So notice my curve is starting at the midline, and then it goes down and back up. This represents one cycle of my curve. So what I just highlighted there in red, well, that kind of looks like a sine curve that's just upside down. So this equation is going to be y equals -4 sine of x plus 2. Oops. I don't know what I just did. Let's do. The only reason why I'm making it negative is because it starts by going down. If it started by going up like this and then turned and came back down like that, then I would have done a positive. All right, let's go into the homework. So the homework says sketch one cycle of each of the following functions. So first one says f of x equals 4 sine of x. So to graph one cycle, I really just care about the part of the x-axis that's on the right-hand side of the y-axis. I know I'm going up to 4 and going down to -4. I know I'm going out to 2 pi for one cycle. I'm going to have a pi, 3 pi over 2, and a pi over 2. I don't have to label all of those, though. I know after a quarter turn, my sine curve is at the maximum. Then I'm back to the minimum. Then I'm going to follow my sine pattern, right? So I'm following my sine pattern. Remember, sine always starts by going up, then back down, then back up. The next one also asks us to graph a sine curve, but this one has a -6. So this is going to have a different midline. The amplitude, however, is just 1. So if I was to graph this, I want to exaggerate where this is. So the x-axis is going to be up here someplace, and I'm going to have the midline at -6. Since the amplitude is 1, I'm going to go up 1, down 1, and then draw the midline in. Again, just like before, I'm going to put in my 2 pi, cut it in half, and then cut it in quarters. So since it's sine, it's going to start at the midline. After a quarter turn, it's going to go up, then back down after a half turn, then back down, and then back up. So it's going to be a hill and a valley. You'll hear me say that a lot in this chapter. Sine curves are hills and valleys. For the last one, it has a amplitude of 2, and it's negative, meaning this is going to be an upside down sine curve, so it's going to look something like that. And it has a midline of -3. So again, we want to exaggerate what we have here. So if my midline is -3, and I'm going to go up 2 and down 2 from that, that means the highest point I have on this graph is going to be -1. And the lowest point is going to be -5. Midline's still -3. We're still going to cut it into our 4 pieces. Sine curve, so it still starts at the midline. But this one's going to, instead of starting by going up, it's going to start by going down after a quarter turn, then back up, then all the way to the maximum, and then we're back where I started. Whoops. There you go. Number 2 says state the range, midline, amplitude, and sketch the graph to justify. So the midline is the equation y equals 2. The amplitude is a equals 7. And the range is going to be from So if the midline is 2 and I have to go down 7, I'm going to be at -5. And then go up 7, I'd be at 9. Notice when I wrote the amplitude, I wrote +7, not -7. The amplitude is the 7. That's the multiplier. The negative is just a reflection. So if I was to graph this, I want to make my x and y graph, right? It doesn't say how many cycles. I'm just going to graph one cycle, so I'll exaggerate it again. So I got to go down to -5 and up to 9. So I want to make my x-axis a little bit closer to -5 so it's scaled correctly. I'm going to go out to 2 pi, cut it in half, and then in quarters. All right, the sine curve is going to start at 2. So there's your midline. So it's going to go from 2 down to -5, back up to the midline, up to 9, and then end back at 2. Right? Now I could graph this in my calculator if I just wanted to verify that it looked right or that the midline and all that stuff was in the right spot. All right, but sketching it is a good skill. Sketch one cycle with an amplitude of 2 and a midline of 1/2. So if the midline is 1/2, there's 1. All right. Amplitude of 2, I'd have to go up to a maximum of 2.5. So we have 2, 3. And I would have to go down by 2, so I'd have to go down to 1.5. So -1, -2. Sine curve, so it's going to start at the midline, going out 2 pi, cut it in half and in quarters. Positive amplitude, so we're going to go up the 2, 1, 2, be halfway between 2 and 3 for 2.5. Go back to the midline, and go halfway between 1 and 2, negative. Oops, that's the wrong spot. So that would be good. And then finish there. Your sine curve should be somewhat symmetrical. Let me look at it. Not symmetrical, you know what I mean, like balanced. All right, let's graph some cosine curves. So cosine curve with a midline of 3. So one cycle, midline of 3, so we have to go up 3, maximum of 4, minimum of 2. Again, we're just cutting in half and then in quarters. Cosine functions are a little different. They're starting at the maximum or the minimum, depending on the amplitude. Then after a quarter turn, they come back to the midline. Half turn, they're at the minimum value. So it's going to turn and look something like that. And it's going to go back up to end at the same exact spot it started. Next one, -4. So we're going to go up to 4 and down to -4. 2 pi, halfway, quarter way. So since it's negative, it's going to start down here at -4. After a quarter turn, I'm back at the x-axis. Half turn, I'm at the maximum now. So it's going to be like a bell-shaped look, right? And then we can just keep going, sketch our graph. It's a sketch. It doesn't have to be perfect. As I try and make it as best I can, right? It's just a sketch. We're just really looking to hit the right spots, those key points. That's all we're looking for. All right, so if we have a midline of -2 and an amplitude of 6, it means the highest value on this graph is going to be 4. The lowest value on this graph is going to be -8. So when I make my x and y axis, I want to do that. So I'm going to go from 4 down here to -8. So our x-axis would be somewhere like that, and -2 would be right in the middle. Here's your 2 pi, cut into quarters. Cosine curve, so it's going to start, since it's positive, at the maximum. Quarter turn will be at the midline. Half turn at the minimum. One more quarter turn at the midline. Full cycle, ends where it started. Number 5 says graph 2 cycles of the sine function whose amplitude is 3, whose midline is y equals -2, and that passes through the point 0, -2. So if I have a midline of -2, The point 0, -2 is on the midline, so that's good. That graphs a sine curve. And just like we did in class, we want to graph 2 cycles, so we want to go out 4, make that 2 pi, go out 4 more, make that 4 pi, that would be 2 cycles. And since the amplitude's 3, I'm going to go up 3, back down to 0, down 3, and then back down to where I started from, back up to where I started from. There's 1 cycle. Second cycle, I'd go up 3, back to the midline, down 3, back to the midline. You'll notice it is just a pattern. Once you figure out the pattern, it's pretty easy. That was actually a Regents question. Number 6 says, determine the amplitude and midline for the function given below. Write an equation that fits this function. So if I'm starting at -5, so my range is from -5 to +9. What would be the middle of that? Right, so I'd have to go up 7, so I'd be at 2. So the midline is y equals 2. That would be halfway between the top and the bottom. The amplitude is a equals 7. And if I was to write an equation, this looks more like a cosine graph. So I'd say 7 cosine of x plus 2. Notice I'm using a positive 7 because I'm starting above the midline and coming down. Here's your 1 cycle of the cosine curve. Right? Cosine curves look like a single valley. Hopefully this video helped with the graphing. Right? We're going to do a little bit more, talk about some more parameters, and then we're going to wind up practicing all the different parameters and how they change your functions for a couple days. So if you don't truly get this right now, but you have the basic idea, we're okay. We'll keep practicing it and we'll be fine. All right? Good luck. Hopefully the video helped.